Hello and a very warm welcome to everyone this evening. I'm Dr. Katie Williams, Technical Manager at Dengie, and I'm delighted to be joined tonight by Lou Robson of Thoroughbred Dressage, back by popular demand. And also this evening, Claire Akers, the performance horse nutritionist at Dengie, who works with Lou on a regular basis, will be joining us. Some key bits of information about tonight, so please put questions in the Q&A or the chat boxes. Claire's going to help me answer feeding queries as we go, and if there are some common themes, we will try to cover them more generally as well. As ever, the webinar is recorded and it will be hosted on our YouTube channel. There's lots of information there already, so please check out some of the other recordings we have. If you've registered for this evening's webinar, which I guess you must have done because you're watching it, then you will receive an email with the link to the recording. But if you're a regular user of YouTube and you find the Dengie Horse Feeds sort of subscription on there, you can go to the videos tab and you will find this recording in due course. So the key really for us was to try and time this webinar for National Racehorse Week. And our aim really is to try and provide information and perhaps a little discussion on how we can feed and manage former racehorses, really with their sort of health, welfare and performance in mind. And the order of proceedings is that I'm going to just talk us through some of the digestive system, some of the latest research and all those sorts of relevant areas of interest, and then Lou is going to follow up with some case studies and some good examples of how we can put that into practice. And obviously Claire and Lou are going to contribute all the way through. So if I make sure my video's on, sorry, and then I will move on to the next slide. So just bear with me a second because I can't see if Lou and Claire are there, but apologies. Hopefully you can, oh, there we go. Hi, Lou. Just making sure you're there as I'm volunteering you to contribute as we go through. So hopefully you're seeing the digestive system on the screen. So when we're thinking about the horse, it is really important we keep in mind always that they are a herbivore. So one of the key takeaways, I guess, from that really is that the stomach is a very small proportion of the horse's gastrointestinal tract. And why that's important is when we're thinking about meal feeding or supplementary feeding to the forage that we're using, we've got to bear in mind that that stomach is very small, it has a limited capacity, and if we overfeed, then everything is going to pass through the whole of the rest of the digestive system much more quickly than it should, which will not only mean it's inefficiently utilised and absorbed, but it can have really serious and significant repercussions for the health of the rest of the digestive system. So we're going to have a little look at some of those key areas. So when we think about how much we're feeding, and I always sort of try to take some practical examples, and this is actually a feeding chart for a racehorse mix. So if we think about the racehorse in training, these are the sorts of quantities of cereal-based feeds or mixes that they're very often given. So for those sort of bigger horses, somewhere between 6 to 9 kilos for heavy work. And you can see the numbers of different scoops there. Now, there is no doubt that that is going to be overloading the horse's digestive tract unless it's in a lot of very small meals, which is not practical on most yards. So we can almost guarantee that at some point that racehorse is going to have an overload of starch into its digestive system, and that will then have repercussions for the microbial population all the way through, including in the stomach. And that's a real shift because over the last sort of 25 years, we're starting to understand that actually there are microbes all the way through the digestive tract. And that has sort of repercussions when we get that dysbiosis or an imbalance in the right kind of bacteria. And it can be a contributing factor to a number of different issues, increasingly potentially the sort of glandular disease that we see in the stomach. But we'll look into that a bit more as we go through. But it's just, we always talk about the horse's stomach being about the size of a rugby ball, and we've got to bear that in mind when we're thinking about how many scoops we're putting into them at any one time. So what's happening in the small intestine? Well, that sort of highly magnified image is showing you the sort of lining, or what we sometimes refer to as the brush border. And all those little finger-like, oh, I don't know why it keeps leaping forward, sorry. All those little finger-like projections are called villi. And they're there to actually increase the absorption capacity in the small intestine. Now, we know in other species, research has shown this quite consistently that if we're feeding high starch diets, that increased level of acidity that we get from that actually withers away the size of these villi. They sort of shrink and reduce in capacity. So we're not getting as good absorption. And that's really why less starch is more in the context of trying to promote weight and condition. And I know Lou's going to talk about this in more detail from a practical application. But what we're trying to get people to sort of appreciate actually is that by reducing the amount of starch, you actually get better utilization of all the other feed ingredients that you're putting in. And so if we can shift the emphasis to using fiber as an energy source, both for work and condition, we're going to actually help improve the absorption capacity of the whole of the digestive tract as well. So that's quite a key kind of, I suppose, change, because we always think we sort of default to those high energy dense sorts of feeds to try and promote weight gain and condition, and it's actually really counterproductive to do that. One of the key things I think we also need to consider is when these horses are in racing and fed a high starch diet, that small intestine is where about 70 to 80% of their immune system is actually in the digestive tract, in the gut, and a tissue type known as Peyer's patches is in that small intestine. So when we feed these high starch diets, which the typical racehorse receives, those villi shrink away, we're actually reducing the immune capability of the horse. So we expose them to lots of pathogens because they're racing, they're traveling, they're seeing other animals, going to novel places that they've not been to before. So we kind of, it's a double whammy really. We're reducing their immune capacity and exposing them to more potential harmful things. So it's no wonder that, you know, these animals do sort of have some issues, digestive issues, and we've got to try and shift the balance, get the gut healthy again, and we will help improve their immune function too. When it comes to the hindgut, we're looking for the microbial population there to be healthy so that they can actually digest fiber, and it's done by a fermentation process. So anytime that you're fermenting something, you're going to get some gas and heat coming off as byproducts. And it's, I say it a lot, but one of the the key things about feeding plenty of fiber to a racehorse, which, you know, they're intentionally bred to be very thin skinned, they're intentionally bred to not have a lot of sort of subcutaneous fat as insulation, because we want them to get heat out of their muscles. They need to be able to run fast, they need to be able to dissipate heat. So they're quite thin skinned. And that actually means that if we can put more forage in, they've got their own central heating system. As they break that down, the fiber is releasing heat as a byproduct of that sort of fermentation process. And it also is helping to produce things like B vitamins. So the sort of old adage, you know, sort of healthy on the inside, healthy on the outside, rings true with this. If we look at their hooves and their sort of general coat condition, if they're looking well, it's a good indicator, and not absolute, but it's a good indicator that actually they're healthier on the inside. If they've got poor quality hooves, dull, starey coats, then that can often relate to some of the issues coming from the hind gut and not having those bacteria that are naturally going to be producing things like B vitamins, the most common of which is biotin that we tend to talk about. And again, just we need to think about the time it takes for these horses to recover from some of these other diets. So hoof horn can actually take 6 to 9 months to grow down. So we've got to give them time when they come out of training to be able to recover, regenerate some healthy sort of hoof horn tissue, for their coats to improve, skin condition, all of those things we need to bear in mind, because the temptation is to have a sort of fit athletic horse. We take it out of sort of race training and want to turn it into a lovely sort of well-conditioned riding horse. All of that will take time, and I'm sure Lou is going to talk a lot more about how long you need to allow for them to go through that transition. We do have some levels of starch that we should be aiming to sort of be below in terms of reducing the risk of digestive upsets. Now they are the sorts of areas where, or the levels where we're trying to stay below from a safety perspective. Research and studies suggest that actually levels lower than that are already starting to compromise things like fiber fermentation, and therefore all these knock-on effects can happen. So whilst these are the sort of safety thresholds, actually any starch going in is going to result in some sort of changes. Some level is probably acceptable, but we are having to bear in mind that we're having repercussions as soon as we start to put any sort of starch into their ration. So what are we trying to achieve when we're building a ration for a horse? I mean, this really applies to any horse, but the basis and the sort of foundation layer in your brick wall that you're building up is that sort of high quality forage. And we tend to advocate ad lib, but actually for the first time I heard someone today saying, you know, ad lib might not actually be the most sustainable approach if you're throwing a lot of it away. So with our sustainability hats on, then actually feeding plenty of forage and trying to get to a level where you're giving the horses much to eat as they want, but without wasting lots, then that's probably how we should be phrasing it in the 21st century. That can include grazing, obviously. And if the horse is happy to be outside, that's great. But if it's not somewhere that they're used to and it's actually causing them some level of stress to be turned out, and also if they're not wasting energy trying to keep warm, and if they're in a group of horses, they're not being bullied, then turnout is great. But you do need to make sure that all of those other things are not occurring, because they're not going to basically put weight on and sort of relax and become happy, healthy horses if they're stressed and not very happy in the sort of environment we're putting, you know, imposing on them, really, especially if it's not something they're used to. It can take time to transition to wanting to be a horse in a field. We do need to make sure that the ration is balanced. So that would be through the use of a supplement or a balancer at the sort of basic level. And I think it's probably fair to say now in about 100% of cases, we would be recommending some form of digestive aid. So something like some yeast or some prebiotics to help try and make the digestive tract healthier, having been on these very sort of high starch diets that are commonly used in training. They're not essential, but I think given those sort of factors that we've talked about, athletic performance and the sorts of diets that they're on, they're going to need some support if they're going to transition successfully into you know, happy, healthy horses. Now, I've put on the right there the sort of use high quality digestible fibres in addition to your high quality forage ad lib. So this is when we're thinking about the bucket feed, the sort of next layer up. Again, these wouldn't be essential if you had a horse, and I think Lou's got some examples of the good doer racehorse. If you have a horse that's a good doer and holding their weight well, then forage ad lib or, you know, to requirement with a balancer or in the form of a supplement or a balancer may actually be all that they need. The additional feed is if you need it. If forage isn't enough, then we're starting to put another layer into our wall and build up the ration. There are lots of high oil feeds, different options that we can use, and we'll probably talk about those a bit more as we go through. But the whole sort of overriding message really is to try and keep the starch and which is coming from your cereals to a minimum. And then the sort of final layer, icing on the cake, or the final layer on the wall, whichever metaphor you prefer, is that we would target with specific supplements for different issues if needed. So it could be additional joint support, respiratory health, skin, whatever it might be. So those are the layers to the ration that we're trying to build up from the foundation of really good quality forage. So what do we mean when we're talking about a good quality source of fibre? And really, when we're talking about good quality, it's really referring to its digestibility. So the higher the digestibility, the more energy is typically going to be available to the horse, but it's coming from fibre. So it's that slow release energy that's going to help you know, build their condition, hopefully without exacerbating any sort of behavioural fizziness, that kind of thing. So as you can see on that spectrum, we've got at one end the straw, top straw, so very low in energy because it's not very digestible, so the horse isn't able to extract very much from it. And at the other end, we've got some sugar beet shreds, and they're highly digestible fibre, so the horse is able to break them down and get the energy from them very easily. And the reason for that is that the sugar beet grows underground. The sugar is actually extracted for use in human food, and we're left with sugar beet pulp. And it's more recently that we tend to drop the pulp, unfortunately, which is why I think confusion exists around sugar beet, because the name implies it's going to have a lot of sugar in, but it's the pulp. So the sugar's been taken out, we're left with the fibrous residue, which is the pulp. that's really digestible because it's grown underground. It doesn't need the structural support of the fibres growing above ground. And so it's really easy for the horse or the microbes within the horse to break it down and extract the energy from it. And then in the middle, you've got things like hay, grass, alfalfa, all ranging in the level of digestibility. But when we're talking about good quality or high quality fibre sources, it's the ones that are going to be broken down more readily and giving you the energy from the sort of fibre within it that the horse can actually utilise. So what would that actually look like in practical terms? Well, we've mentioned grazing, so that's ideal if the horse is happy out there. And then we're talking about things like dengiafriol or the performance fibre, which are the conditioning kind of fibre feeds with a high oil coating, so you're utilising the high quality fibre with the oil combined. Then you've got your alpha beet, which is your sugar beet alfalfa combination that you're adding on the top. We're going to balance that with the performance balancer if the horse is in work and obviously perhaps needs a little bit of additional support for improved hoof quality and coat condition. The digestive aid, if basically we're trying to help restore a healthy digestive tract, and then ad lib forage. The minimum requirement really needs to be 1% of body weight, and that's an absolute minimum. We would ideally want that in addition to grazing, and it's also important to consider that some of those chopped fibres and the alpha beet type products would actually be contributing to the overall sort of forage requirement. So they can actually be making up part of that ration and contributing to the horse's overall forage needs. If the horse doesn't want to eat a lot of forage, or you haven't got turnout, or you've got limited quality of or availability on forage, then you can use a forage replacer on a weight for weight basis. So those are the sorts of practical things we're talking about in terms of what a ration could actually look like for a horse that's basically coming out of training and you're looking to put condition and weight on safely. Now we do have some new insights, some recently published work that fibre is actually able to support horses in reasonably high levels of work, or very high levels of work in this case. And it's building on work that's been done before. So we've had studies from the 1980s going that far back really, that actually show the volatile fatty acids, or the end products of fibre fermentation, can be used as an energy source. But the key thing is you've got to make sure there's enough there for the animal to use. So if we put it in, the horse can utilise it. And the researchers actually found that when we get to the threshold in terms of when the horse is working, the point at which they change from working aerobically to working anaerobically, so around 90% of VO2 max, that's where we can start to make metabolic changes happen. And with high fibre diets, we can actually show that we can spare some of that glycogen store that the horse has in its muscles, and we're actually starting to affect the metabolic performance of the animal. Now, those previous studies in the 1980s looked at one time point, and what this more recent work from the research group at Lab to Field in France have actually shown, they've basically replicated that but over a much longer period of time, so 8 weeks, and they were actually using, rather than sort of horses in a laboratory or research environment, they've actually used standard bred racehorses in training, and that's the first time that a study on that scale has actually been carried out. And again, to put it into some practical context as to what people were actually feeding and doing, the controlled diet was effectively grass hay, traditional grass hay, and oats, which is quite a common ration for racehorses in France. And the trial, or the sort of study group, were really then on a sort of predominantly sort of high quality fibre ration. So a third, or 33% of the total ration, was alfalfa, and just 7% were oats. And in real terms, that equated to 4 kilos of alfalfa and 1 kilo of oats, so much lower than you would typically see fed to racehorses. Both diets were formulated to meet the requirements of a horse in heavy work, and because of the higher inclusion of alfalfa, the sort of the trial diet, if you like, the test diet, had slightly higher levels of protein than the control diet. Because if you're going to match for energy, it's very hard to then try and match on protein as well, just to the nature of the different ingredients. And what the researchers found was that horses on a fibre diet performed comparably to those with fed the higher level of oats. Their muscle development was the same. They were measuring the muscle depth and muscle sort of tone. But the findings suggest there was actually a shift in the energy metabolism of those trial horses. So what it sounds a bit perhaps, oh, well, they just matched the performance, maybe doesn't sound what we were looking for, but actually it is in this scenario, because we're not looking to do any better than what the horses on the starch-based ration were achieving. We're just trying to match it and prove that actually it's not a barrier to performance, or it's not going to compromise performance by moving them onto a more fibre-based diet and a much lower proportion of oats. So as far as I'm concerned, that's a win, in the sense that we're not compromising for performance by feeding them higher fibre rations. And in that study, the authors concluded that this type of diet could actually help to delay the onset of fatigue, because we're shifting the way the horse is using the energy and how it's using the energy stores available to it. We're actually helping to potentially delay the onset of fatigue, which is what we've sort of seen when people have used higher levels of oil in rations. And we're seeing the same sort of effect, which makes sense because they're just all producing fatty acids as an energy source, so just different types of them. So that's really positive. We're actually starting to show that we can feed these horses on high fibre rations, but it's always never as straightforward as that, is there? There's always challenges. And this is where I'm going to call upon Lou and Claire in a few seconds to talk about some of the practical challenges. So with the thoroughbred, are they actually a fussy horse? Can we say for sure there is something in their breeding or the genetics that makes them a little bit more selective about what they will and won't eat? And I think this, when I was part of my PhD, I was looking at horses that were hospitalised, and independently of one another, there were hospitals which, due to their location, cared for a high number of thoroughbred horses. So you can guess sort of Lambourne, Newmarket, those kind of areas. And we were interviewing nurses, vets within the hospitals, and independently of one another, they all talked about the fact that they found the thoroughbreds particularly difficult to eat relative to the general population that would come into the hospital. So their referral hospitals happen to have a high proportion of thoroughbreds coming in, but obviously have warm blood, sport horses, ponies, etc. as well. And all of them said that we interviewed that it wasn't necessarily a direct response to pain. It wasn't necessarily that they had ulcers. It was effectively horses in and out of training. It could have been riding horses that were thoroughbreds, not necessarily racehorses. And they felt that there was definitely a trend for them to be the more sensitive to the change of environment and the more sensitive potentially to the change of diet. And studies have actually shown that in the racing fit thoroughbreds in particular, they can be more difficult to manage in terms of post-operative recovery. They are prone to having more gastrointestinal complications, things like colic, ileus and colitis. In that scenario, we have to question whether it's because the gut's potentially unhealthy in the first place, just because the diets that they're on. But generally, in terms of fussiness, it isn't related to necessarily fitness or training level. So what can we do? And Lou and Claire, please come in on this one, because on a day-to-day basis, you are definitely dealing with horses and trying to overcome the challenges of getting them to eat. We obviously advocate and talk about the sort of cafeteria style, giving them lots of different choices. But what are your top tips for trying to encourage fussy feeders?
Claire, do you want to start? Or do you want me to start?
Yeah, I suppose really that this buffet, find out what it is they're not happy to eat. We can take that out of the ration, look at options. What are they happy to eat? And I think sometimes the challenge is that changes. So you can get them to eat something one day and then the next day they're not so keen. So I think keep trying this. We did have a yard that an event rider that I was working with, where she was like, this horse is so fussy, and we split his feed up into 4 or 5 different buckets, and he ate everything. And from that day onwards, that's how she fed him, and he ate up everything, but didn't like them all mixed together. So I think sometimes we have to pander to them a little bit. I think it's looking at why they're not eating. Is it that they're so busy because they want to go out in the field, or something else is about to happen? So look at your timing of things, and kind of sometimes it's changing that. So maybe if you've got I don't know, if they go out in the morning, don't give them a token breakfast, put them out in the field, and then they could have a lunch when they come in and a bigger dinner or something. So change the timing, because if that's the thing that's putting them off, then that's fine. We can work around it. I don't know. Anything else, Lou?
No, I completely agree with you. So we have it in the winter hours in at night and out during the day. And I would say most of ours, they obviously get excited in the mornings for their breakfasts. And about half of them will eat up everything I put in front of them, and the other half will eat most of it and leave some. So again, I'm not stressed about them having to eat everything because they want to go out to the field, because they're like, get us out, let us move. They know their routine. So they do come in to lunches and stuff like that. We have all of ours on straw beds as well. So Katie mentioned, you know, straw doesn't have that much to it. But again, if the horse wants to pick, like, we just give them access to everything. We have it with some horses where we have 3 different types of haylage here, 3 different types of forage. So we give them different types of forage. We might put nets differently around the stable. So again, just to kind of encourage them to slightly move, but also so they feel like they're kind of almost grazing around their stable a little bit as well. And we do give some of ours like treat balls, because again, that kind of idea of like graze, move, something sounds fun. Again, it's just a way of enticing them to kind of eat and move rather than having a bucket. Because some of them, I know that we know horses can't vomit, but some of them, I swear, I put a bucket in front of them, they look like they're going to be sick if I give them more food. They're like, no more. But actually, if you make it a bit more joyful for them, they find the fun in it, and then they're kind of doing more of like their natural grazing, moving thing rather than just staying still. And it sounds silly, like we even do it whereby we had one this year that was on box rest, and he was just struggling with the box rest. But what we did was we put a hay net in between him and his mate that he could touch, and because his mate ate it, he ate it as well. So he had his own hay net, a hay net between him and his friend, and that just stopped him having to go away from his friend. He could hang out with his friend and still eat, and they kind of ate together. So like you said, it's just finding ways through that basically keep them happy, and as long as they're happy and content, they will eat and they will settle. But it's finding what makes them happy, which can send you as a human slightly bonkers in the process, but it's worth the slightly bonkersness.
Yeah, I think it is that some of them are very much followers, aren't they, and having that pal or someone leading them and showing them the way is all they kind of need, and then they're happy. Do you tend to, I mean, I used to do this with my horse when he was stabled, but cutting up the carrots, hiding it in the big trug of just chopped fibre or whatever grass might be, just give them a bit of stimulation and foraging around and stuff like that.
Sometimes I find that they get ungrateful and they put their foot in the bucket and just pull the bucket everywhere to find the carrots. So like sometimes I've tried it, but most of the times I then just hear buckets going everywhere. And then buckets being picked up and used as weapons for their next door friend to like smack with it. So the idea, yes, sometimes it works, and sometimes putting carrots or apples in the hay net as well gets them to actually go to it, but
find it.
But I normally, like, if you pretend like you don't want them to have it, so even silly things like putting a hay net, because they've got open front stables, a hay net the other side of the door, so again it's tied up to the tie ring, it's almost like they feel like they shouldn't have it, so then they want to eat it more, and you're like, okay, fine, no worries, like, there you go.
I think sometimes as well with these fussy ones with limited appetite, I would give them much smaller feeds, and like almost it seems a bit backward when you've got a horse that needs more condition, but actually get them kind of wanting the next feed. So give them a tiny bit, something that they, you found that they will eat, but keep it really small. You can build it up in time, but my mare can be quite fussy at times.
Oh, she's frozen.
And that normally we just drop. We're back.
You are back, go for it.
So so just making it smaller for a day or two, and potentially then building it up if you can be really useful.
Yeah, I think don't overface is the kind of rule of feeding, isn't it, in that sense? But
yeah,
we're in danger of anthropomorphizing, but I'm sure there's some common sense to the fact that if you're poorly as a human or you're better strapped, big meals are not what you want to be faced with, are they? So yeah, it makes sense to start small and build up, and lots of different things, see what kind of attracts their attention. And great, so thank you for that, some really interesting insights. I thought it was interesting to look at some of the more modern mixes and cubes and things that are available on the market as well, because there is definitely a trend towards higher fibre feeding. And whilst that's really positive, and obviously we're all advocates for more fibre in the ration, sometimes I think we have to be careful about how some of these products are actually marketed and positioned, because many are described as low starch and yet still are actually 15 to 18%. The lowest one I could find is 8%, and that is still 4 times higher than using a chopped fibre and oil, whoever's chopped fibre and oil you put together. So do look at the detail, because sort of headlines aren't always the full story. And you can see there on this example ingredient list the sorts of different fibres that you will see included into mixes and cubes that perhaps don't lend themselves to being chopped fibres, because they're in, they come in sort of meals or granules, and then you can pellet them and include them in. So things like soya hulls, dried sugar beet pulp is increasingly being used as an ingredient in feeds, but things like pea flakes, soya, they are actually going to contribute some starch. So we want some nutrition from the quality protein from the soya and that kind of thing, but it will have some starch that it's contributing. So that's why when we deconstruct it down, take the fibre, take the oil, take the balancer as separate sort of elements, rather than having it in a mix or a cube, you've got greater control over what's going in. So where they can be really useful is if they can be more energy dense. So when we've got these horses with very limited appetites, we are at least still getting a fibre base to the diet, even if it's pelleted with other ingredients. So we might just still be able to then get a little bit more in than we would if it was in a chopped format. So useful, but not, do look beyond the headlines to see exactly what's in there and what it's contributing. I just thought I'd run through some of the sort of digestive aids that are available to us now, because there is some evidence in humans that if we can try and improve gut health, it will actually help appetite as well. We certainly don't have evidence in horses that's conclusive, but just restoring a healthy microbial population, having a healthier gut will, should in theory help them just as much as it does for us. So as I mentioned, when we sort of just had a quick look at the digestive system and the different elements of it, we have microbes now all the way through the digestive tract, and that's accepted by most people, that we have a bacterial population in the horse's stomach. And the horses rely on them not only for breaking down fibre to release energy, but they're also a really important part of the sort of immune function, and they're also helping to regulate acidity. Some of the bacteria are called lactic acid utilizing bacteria, so they are taking the acid produced in the gut, converting it into a less acidic sort of form, if you like, and then helping to regulate acidity in the digestive tract. So they have really important functions, and it's, to my continual frustration and every other nutritionist's frustration, we have no live bacteria in the form of a probiotic actually approved for horses. Now, the term probiotic is used for other live components, so yeast, but live bacteria are not approved for horses. Even in veterinary supplements, they should not have a live bacteria in them if they're being marketed for horses. So it is frustrating. The slight irony to that is we can actually take poop from another horse, put it into a horse, and try and do basically a transfusion to help put bacteria into the gut, which seems slightly more drastic and sort of fraught with dangers, but we haven't got a live bacterial probiotic. But that's one of the ironies of life, isn't it? So what do yeasts do? Well, yes, they're live, and they're actually the sort of fungi, and there's a natural population of fungi, and the research now is starting to show that fungal dysbiosis in the gut can be just as damaging as a bacterial dysbiosis. Again, these things are all evolving, but they help to improve fibre digestion, and they're a bit like your mum and dad cutting up your food for you when you're little. So they start to break down the fibre structure, and they expose more of the sort of surface area of the fibre and allow the bacteria to come in and ferment it more efficiently. So they have an important role. There's various forms of live yeast that are actually specifically approved for horses. So they are an approved additive. I use that word advisedly, for horses. And they're a really good addition to the ration when we're trying to help horses make more use of fibre. We also have the term prebiotics, and they're actually substances that will act on bacteria in the gut, but they are not live. So the pre means sort of for life or before life. So they're helping the bacteria in the gut, but they're not live themselves. The sort of common examples would be fructooligosaccharides or FOS. And we also have a relatively new definition. Everyone's cottoned onto it quite quickly in the equine nutrition world. So you'll see postbiotics being talked about in a lot of feeds and supplements. But I think the definition was only really agreed on in 2021 by an organisation, ISAP. And you can see the definition there. It basically is something that is no longer live. So it was live once, but it's been gently killed off. So it still retains its structure. And when we put it into the gut, the sort of microbiota that are in the gut will actually respond to it. So they sense it's there, because obviously bacteria don't have eyes and ears and aren't going to kind of see bacteria and realize the other one is dead. But if it's coming into the gut and its presence there, even though it's not live, is actually still having an effect on the sort of environment in the gut and the other bacteria and microbes that live there. So most of us will use different combinations of these ingredients to try and help improve gut health, the microbial population, and therefore sort of fibre digestion. We're all, with a reliance really, or trying to get better utilisation of the forage and less reliance on the bucket feeds. That's the overall aim. And again, we can try to increase fibre intake in other ways, and we've got welfare uppermost in our thoughts at the moment. Well, increasingly at the moment, it's a hot topic and a very topical issue for lots of reasons. But Lou, you alluded to this just a second ago in terms of helping horses to take in more fibre by allowing them to browse on bedding and straw. And I know you use straw as a bedding, I guess for practical reasons, but that as well.
So I use it, I'm not going to lie, it's a lot cheaper than shaving. It's a lot cheaper. But also, like I said, the horses can browse, but also I can like actually have bigger beds for the horses, as in, I know might sound a bit daft, but I can have bigger, softer beds for the horses. They then want to sleep and be more comfortable. And I think sometimes we get so het up on this idea of like, we look at them and we want them to obviously be well, and we want them to be well conditioned, but a lot of that comes from their mental state to then aid their physical state. They kind of work together. And I do, like, I know it sounds silly, but I see more horses sleeping better on the big straw happy fluffy beds than the shavings beds. And again, we're kind of like, the cost of living isn't great. It's quite difficult for all of us, whether we work in the equine industry or not, or we have horses. And I think sometimes we go, oh, actually, we not limit, but we go, okay, 2 bales of shavings a week, whereas the straw is cheaper, more available. The horses can browse it. The farmer that I get it from is amazing. So it's not even dusty, like it's good quality straw. Because I think sometimes you can get that as well, where everyone's like, well, I don't want to use straw because of the dust. But if you have good quality straw that isn't dusty, the horses want to eat it, nibble it, and then they want to sleep on it. You get that whole comfort of the horse the whole way around. So that's my thoughts behind it.
Yeah, no, and it's really interesting to see. I think the veterinary profession, I've got some examples, and I don't want to go too much off tangent, but or off at a tangent. I think the whole sort of change in terms of doing the best for horses and actually understanding if we are going to put them in a stable, we need to create an environment in which they're happy to lay down and go to sleep. We know how important sleep is for us in terms of memory and health and well-being. Why wouldn't it apply to other animals? So I like this particular study because it was a decent size of horses used in it. It was actually a study in Germany. And for one thing, they showed that the horses were actually taking longer to eat their forage, because even when they had plenty of forage, they seemed to appreciate being able to move between browsing on their bedding and coming back to the straw. So the whole process took longer, which is what we want to achieve in terms of, to your point, we don't want to overfeed if we don't have to. And if we can make our hay and our forage go further, that's got to be a good thing. And we don't want them spending long periods of time without forage. If they are stabled for long periods, it's going to increase the risk of ulcers and all sorts of other issues. So that was, I think, a really useful and a good sort of sample size. The authors actually state in that study the horses need to chew as a high priority for their welfare. Where has sort of concerns come from? Well, obviously people seem to associate straw with an ulcer risk. Well, that's not the case. There's been one study done where when horses were fed straw as the only or the majority forage source, there was an increased risk of ulcers, but as a part of the ration, and we've had subsequent studies showing that up to half of the diet can be fed as wheat straw or straw generally to replace haylage with no ill effects, including looking at ulcers specifically. There's these sort of concerns about it, I suppose, also come from horses gorging on it and eating too much and potentially having an impaction colic. But thoroughbred is probably not as likely to do that as a greedy pony. So in the context of former racehorses, I'm not concerned about that. But even when we have those sorts of greedy ponies where they might have EMS and things, straw is a really useful ingredient. And it's so frustrating to see all this misinformation about straw when we're trying to bring the sugar levels and calorie levels down, and people are getting so frustrated trying to find a suitable hay or forage for their animal and avoiding straw, which is a real shame. But these are some of the things from that sort of prominent or eminent vets have been writing about in the last few sort of weeks and months, really. So Imogen Burrows is actually the chair of the Beaver Ethics and Welfare Committee. She's been writing in Horse and Hound and Your Horse about trying to change perceptions, including advice perhaps given by the veterinary profession, changing across to straw. And I think just a couple of weeks ago, maybe even last week, Rebecca Hamilton Fletcher was writing the same, trying to encourage this foraging activity. So I think there's definitely growing awareness that foraging and browsing on straw bedding has a really positive effect on welfare. And you can replicate it to some extent by using buckets of sort of chopped straw or predominantly straw-based forage products if for any reason you can't bed on straw. But have you ever had any issues with them overeating it?
No. And we even have warm bloods here as well, and we have like a couple of fat little cobs as well. And they would literally eat themselves to death if they could. One of the warm bloods could do that. And she doesn't even pig out on her straw. She doesn't eat everything. And I think again it's a myth, and people worry and they've got concern, but I would much rather know that the horse has got their guts continually moving by having something always to pick at all the time than being stood without anything. And I've never, like I said, we've got a full range of full-blown fatties. The thoroughbreds don't gorge on their beds, but we've got proper fatties, and even they don't eat it. Like their beds are still there.
Yeah, I think if my concern would be slightly if there was nothing else, and that's all a kind of really hungry pony had access to, then there is a risk attached to it. But when there's other alternatives and we're encouraging browsing rather than the sort of gorging, then I think we're on fairly safe ground. Claire, did you want to add something?
Yeah, I was just going to say, my experience as well, they might, when they first go onto a straw bed or a clean, a new straw bed, they might pick at it more, but it generally settles down. It's probably not as appealing as the forage that they're getting. So I think it's worth monitoring, but I think if they're not eating vast quantities, then, but yeah, I found, I've seen horses that have eaten a lot to begin with, but it slows down in time.
Yeah, brilliant, thank you. So just one of the other sort of myths or bits of misinformation that gets banded around is whether we can actually use haylage for perhaps in the context of either overexcitability or it's going to kind of rev them up, and or in the context of ulcers. So we do use this slide a lot. So if you've been to previous webinars, you will have probably seen this slide, but I have recently updated it with the most sort of up-to-date information from the Dengie analysis that we do for customers. And you can see over the last 5 years, the sort of average dry matter of what would have historically just been lumped into the haylage category is 77.8%. So actually not that far off being hay. Hay's usually sort of around 84%. So we're much higher than the traditional haylage, which would be probably in the region of sort of 55 to 65%. And that does have an impact. So if we haven't got enough moisture, you're not going to have a fermentation process going on. So a more accurate name for these wrapped forages is wrapped hay rather than haylage. And it is quite frustrating that, you know, it's not always kind of described accurately in research trials and studies that are done, and it's certainly not always described accurately when it's sold on the market. So I think it's well worth investing in some analysis. If you do a dry matter and a pH test, which are relatively low cost analyses to do, it would actually give you an indication as to how, well, a very clear indication as to how acidic it is, but how likely it is to be a wrapped hay or a haylage, and therefore is it suitable. I'm just going to see how so the scenarios where you would want to use a wrapped hay are where you are trying to give the animal a slightly more digestible form of forage, perhaps compared to traditional dried hay. So we want to make sure that it's not putting extra acidity into the digestive tract. They are, you know, obviously wrapped, so it's very convenient for storage, and it has lots of you know, sort of benefits in that area over traditional normal hay. But because it's more digestible, it's likely to be more conditioning and therefore ideal for the poorer doer or those just needing a bit more energy for work. The more we can utilise forage as an energy source, the less of reliance there is on the cereals. They do often are more palatable for fussy horses as well. So if we can show that it isn't acidic, it's a wrapped hay rather than a haylage, there's no reason not to use it if you have a horse with ulcers. And as I say, a relatively cost-effective analysis can confirm that for you if you're in any doubt. I just wanted to highlight some of the risk factors for ulcers, because when we talk about racehorses, you know, it's one of the hot topics for any animal, but particularly given the risk factors or the kind of exposure to those risk factors that the racehorse in training has. And I thought this was a really interesting study. So in 2021, a researcher kind of explored whether a risk calculator that had been developed by a journalist in the US was accurate, and they actually found it was quite good. So those that came in, they scoped the horses, they kind of completed the survey that the journalist had developed, and then correlated that with whether the horse had ulcers or not. So in the low risk category, there were only 14%. In the medium risk, 45% had ulcers, and in the high risk, 94% had ulcers. So actually the kind of risk calculator was really quite accurate. And so we developed one and built on that. So it's on our website if you are interested in sort of looking at all the factors that contribute to gastric ulcer risk. Do check it out, and you can see how they kind of relate to one another. If you are specifically interested in ulcers, there are lots of recordings on our YouTube channel about gastric ulcers. So I don't want to go over that again, but I did want to just highlight the relationship between stress and EGGD, because again, the sort of glandular disease in the horse's stomach is the one that can be very difficult to treat. And you might get some improvement, but actually getting resolution on some of these cases of EGGD is very hard, and I can appreciate how frustrating it is, and it can be. I think what we're increasingly seeing, and we've been to both the international sort of colic conference this year and a Vet PD webinar where they had experts from all around the world talking about these EGGD cases that won't heal. And I think it's also important to really kind of bring to the fore just how significant a factor stress is in the development, the risk of EGGD developing, and then as a barrier to trying to get healing to occur. Because we're not dealing with that underlying stress and removing the sort of cause, then we're not going to get a resolution, however much medication, however much management change we make. And what was really kind of resonating from a paper by Charbin et al. And also at the colic conference, a Dutch university hospital are doing a very similar study. They're just recording the kind of prevalence of EGGD in those teaching horses in that university hospital. Now, the Charbin et al. Paper was published 2023, and they'd been looking over a 3-year period. And these animals were just going through their normal routine. So yes, they're exposed to quite a bit of stress because they've got lots of different people handling them. But what they effectively found was that EGGD might improve, worsen, or even resolve over time without medical intervention. And the risk factors that can actually be attributed to that or contributing to it were environment, breed, number of handlers, the hierarchy, and stress. And the diet was fairly consistent all the way through, but certainly not a risk factor that those authors highlighted. And although the Dutch researchers have not had that length of time yet, they were sort of reporting a similar finding. So regardless of what diet sort of changes they were making, these animals would have potentially EGGD much more in relation to the levels of stress they were exposed to. And there have been previous studies showing that the number of handlers is also, a really key risk factor for the presence of EGGD. Now, sometimes there are things we can't do and we can't avoid that. If we've got horses in livery and you've got different staff coming in at weekends versus the week and all of those things, it's very difficult, but we just need to keep that in mind when we're looking for explanations as to why perhaps medicines aren't working. And again, very important to keep in mind that correlation doesn't mean causation. So yes, stress is a significant risk factor, but it's not necessarily the cause, but it's certainly setting the animal up to be more predisposed to having the problem. I've also just sort of dropped in here at this point, it's worth noting that from a feed perspective, we cannot publish anything. So even if we do research studies relating to feed that showed it was preventative to ulcers or helped to manage whatever ulcers, we can't make those claims. We can't use that work publicly because no feed is allowed to be promoted as being able to treat, cure, or prevent a disease, and that would include ulcers. So feeds are very definitely not medicines, and we should be using moderate claims accordingly. Also, just in terms of the sort of treatment options for gastric ulcers and gastric disease, some of the preliminary work that's been done where omeprazole has been used to treat gastric ulcers, and just as in humans that are using omeprazole, there is seemingly a reduction in calcium absorption as a result of that. So it's just something to bear in mind. If you're using it for the longer term, then it could actually have a sufficient sort of impact on the amount of calcium the horse is absorbing, and we might want to adjust the diet to compensate for that. So just be mindful of it, get some advice if you are using omeprazole over the longer term. And I just wanted to finish off really with the sort of beta approval mark and what it actually means. It is an independent assessment of fees. They have to meet certain criteria, and as part of the approval process, it goes in front of the Veterinary Medicines Directorate. So they are there to ensure that companies aren't making false claims, so attributing medicinal sort of properties to feeds. And that's why we can't actually put any positive inclusion of ingredients in. So there's lots of things that could be beneficial, but we can't make claims attached to them. So it's usually much more about what isn't in that product. So i.e. we want a low level of starch rather than the positive things that we might be doing to try and help recovery from ulcers. So it's why some brands wouldn't apply if they're trying to attribute positive attributes to some of their products, but it is an independent assessment of the suitability of a particular product. So technically, supplements are actually or don't exist in feed legislation. They would be considered the same as a feed, and the Veterinary Medicines Directorate have a fairly uneasy relationship with them because just by presentation they can actually often appear to be medicines, and it was the VMD that asked specifically that they weren't included in this scheme. So again, it would be their sort of we wouldn't get their approval for the mark if the supplements were going to be in it. So it was their requirement, they weren't included. I think on that note, I'm probably going to hand over to Lou to talk us through some of the management and other areas, practical case studies, and we'll try and answer some questions behind the scenes. So if I stop the share, if anyone wants to ask questions about the different feeds, please do, but I'm conscious of time, so I'm not going to go on for too much longer, as we all want to hear from Lou. Right, Lou, you should be able to share your screen.
There we go. Can you see that? Does that make sense?
Yes.
Amazing.
There we go.
So obviously it's about feeding and managing, and I just wanted to, with this evening, I know that I'll talk through it, but basically I think it's so important that we always understand these horses, like of exactly what it is that we're working with. And someone's going to be like, well, we're working with racehorses, like duh. But obviously they're built for speed, but it doesn't mean that like we're taking horses that are mad or crazy and trying to do something else. But I think it's really important that we understand the breed the best we can and why they are bred to do what they're going to do, which then helps us manage them, develop like their mental and physical way the whole way through. So this is what we're starting with. We're starting with a horse that's bred to run fast. That's basically it, whether it's fast in a straight line, fast around a bend, or fast with jumping efforts. So whether we go from 6 furlongs to 2.5 miles, the answer is who can get to from A to B the quickest and keep their jockey on board in the process. So this is what we are starting with, and these are why these horses are bred and kind of brought to us on this planet, is to become fast and become quick. And then what we might then, oh, this is where I've realized I'm listen to Paul. But this is what we also start with, is we're starting with horses that start off in this environment. They start off in a herd environment with riders that kind of either sit above them, sit below them, or like kind of stay above them. They don't kind of work in an outline. The horses are kind of left to work in their own natural way. And from my perspective as a dressage rider, and I'm looking to kind of retrain these horses into dressage, we've kind of got the horse on the left here, which is Kento. He's one of he won the World Breeding Championships as a 6 and 7-year-old under Lottie Fry. He's gone on to win Small Tour Championships. He is a breeding dressage stallion. And then the horse on the right is a racehorse. So this is Greg, or saying Greg, well, he's part of the Godolphin Lifetime Aftercare program. And it's just looking at these kind of two different conformational points of where we're starting. Like I said, I've got a bit more of a dressage focus, but even if you're jumping, we're still talking about changing the way these horses work and their posture and their balance, and how the kind of the feeding helps develop that. But it's kind of a whole approach of, it's not just about, you know, Katie was talking about ulcers and we've got to get the gut right to then make everything kind of work better. But how does that affect the whole horse, and how does that make us then be able to develop them properly? Like Katie mentioned it lightly about their feet, but also their temperament and us being able to kind of ride and train them. So this is a kind of like basically spot the difference. We're kind of aiming for the horse on the left, but we're never going to get it because our horses aren't kind of put together like this. And then we've got the horse on the right. So I think it's really important that we always highlight that we train the horse that we have in front of us, not the horse that we want. So you can straight away see the differences of like how the neck's positioned on, the amount of space for a saddle, the fact that Greg on the right is slightly croup high, so his bottom is higher than that of his withers, that the forelimb is positioned differently. So basically, like I said, we're starting with the horse on the right, and it's nothing wrong because that's why we're all here, but that's what we love. And so what is it? I might actually like kind of come out of this so you can see this a bit easier, because I know that sometimes it cuts off on the screen. So basically, with a racehorse, you want them to run as fast as possible. So the best way I can phrase it is, where we sit is where they split. So to be a good racehorse, you want the longest stride length as possible with the minimal amount of effort. And so to allow that to happen, their body's got to kind of be put together in the best way possible to allow them to do that. So to allow them to do that, their forelimb is slightly positioned behind the vertical. Their hind legs are built out behind them and literally in the middle. Whereas a riding horse, we want horses to lift up through the back and kind of carry us. And we're looking towards this ideal of push, lift, balance. Where you sit is where they split in half. And so this already kind of shows you how fantastic the thoroughbred is. It already shows you how adaptable they are, but it also means that we've then got to be really mindful of what we're doing and the kind of the journey that we're taking these horses on and the time scale that goes with it. So when we're then also trying to train them and develop them, it's the horses that kind of come alongside with it. So you might feel as a rider, if you're already cantering your ex-race horse, that you sometimes feel like you're falling down a mountain edge. That is because these horses are croup high and everything kind of naturally the energy pushes up, comes down into the wither, and their shoulder kind of rotates down. So the forelimb being positioned behind the vertical allows their shoulder to rotate down. So when they hit the gallop phase, as a rider, you almost feel like the horse sinks down like a foot and then they extend out. So these are the kind of forces that happen. And like I said, you might as a rider then feel that as weight in the rein, them being one-sided, sharp to the leg. You put the leg on, they run forward. That's not only to do with their understanding of their first career, but also where their balance and everything puts them. And that's Greg on the left. and also Greg on the right. So Greg's body versus what Greg could possibly do. So you can transform them and for them to become more uphill and more balanced, but this takes time. And when I'm saying time, I mean years. I don't mean weeks. I don't mean days. The horse on the right and the horse on the left here are the same horse. It's Quad. It's one of my highest competing ex-race horses. Horse on the right looks like a Thoroughbred pony. Horse on the left looks like a dressage horse. Same horse, literally, I think a couple of days apart. And again, it's just that his conformation isn't built to naturally do the job. And it doesn't mean these horses can't do it, but how do we do it? And how do we condition them safely? Which I think is a really, really, really key point with these horses. So again, you can just see here with the forces that are happening. This is Quad warming up for his first Prix Saint-Georges. But again, you can see with the forelimb just how much the forelimb naturally comes underneath their body, how much his back naturally drops away, how much his bottom comes up, how much he needs to use his neck to balance. So I think a big misconception with these horses is that feeding is going to build us top line and feeding is going to make them these fat, round, balanced, fantastic horses. It aids it, but it also aids the development of the right muscles. It also aids the development of the kind of temperament and the rideability. It also is so vital in their hoof growth because there's also, you know, the phrase no foot, no horse. And it works all together. So even like your saddler, if you've got better muscular development, your saddle will fit better, the horse will be in better balance, the horse can hold themselves, they can carry a rider better with you sat on top of them rather than being above them. So it all kind of works together. Just with this image here of Harry, again, you can naturally, or what you again more than likely going to see in the early stages is your area number 2 is they're going to be very weak at the base of the wither, so saddle fitting is going to be a problem. Again, your back area is naturally going to be very, very weak. The underside of their necks are going to be very strong. So at 0.4 and 0.1, again, it just shows you the angle difference of where the forelimb is positioned behind the vertical. You're never going to change how genetically they're put together. Never going to change it. So you have to get your head around that quite quickly. And again, symmetries from right to left, front to back, because most horses, I think 70% of race courses in the UK are left-hand runs. So they're very good at cantering left, not so good at cantering right. And you normally see a very big left shoulder and a very weak right hind in comparison. But again, it's very easy to kind of go, when we're looking at the whole horse and we're looking at the condition of the whole horse, is to kind of say, well, they're weak there, or we need to kind of do this, or we need to build them up there. So we kind of naturally go to feeding them more and insert what you feed them. But that's not the answer. The condition comes with the comfort of the horse being able to condition safely. And when you've got these horses, they've got these asymmetries and they're built in a particular way, comfort comes in so many different forms. So if they're not comfortable in their body and they're not comfortable in their feet and they're not comfortable in their brain, you can then get certain misbehaviors or behaviors you don't necessarily like or don't want to see. So therefore, again, it's very easy to jump to, well, it's the feed, or I'm feeding it this, or this feed, insert whatever makes them go crazy. Actually, sometimes it comes down to the comfort of the horse and how the horse is working and the language that you create with these horses. These horses start off with a life with you know, contact doesn't really exist. You know, the rein is just there to literally stop, start, steer, and hopefully keep someone on board. You might hear the phrase bridging of reins. You know, it's all this kind of thing of that's their first language. And then when we take them into the retraining world, straight away, people will be very quick to tell you, well, they must work from behind and step under and lift up and do this and push from behind and lift up through their back. But the question is, are they able to? And actually, more importantly, do they understand the question that we're asking of them? And, you know, how far along are they? Do they really understand? Can they? And I think that's a big misconception. When we first get them home, or when we first start sitting on them, if you've done all your break and your long reining and stuff and you get on them and you're all excited, you will naturally see a very upside down horse, a horse that looks frankly a little bit ugly and a little bit less than desirable. It's very normal, it's very common, and it's really easy to see the long-term picture. And it's very easy as well with social media as well to see these transformation photos of this horse changed so much in 3 seconds. It's not the real of life, and it's also kind of how are these horses going to sustain a future? Horses live for years, they don't just live for seconds. And again, when you're on top of them, you'll see head tilting, you'll see like ears up your nostrils, you'll see the works. And again, it's so tempting to kind of try and find a quick fix because it's less than desirable for what we're seeing and what we're hoping for. Just also a thing with this, yes, this horse is in side reins. I don't agree with side reins, but this horse was first day out of racing, and I was told it runs away and jacks its neck in the air and bogs off. So that's why he's in side reins, because I didn't fancy being water skied around the arena. I didn't fancy losing him. But again, this is what we see. We see a hollow back, we see a neck up, we see a horse with a slightly almost stilted gait. And, you know, when we see them stood up, we see them maybe a bit, some people might say lean, I just say race fit. You know, they're kind of fit animals. They're strong over the back for their job. They carry minimal body fat percentage. And so I think it's quite difficult to see the long-term game. I think it's really, 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 really important that we just say feeding alone doesn't build top line. It does aid it, it develops it, it helps them, but it is not there for who can have the biggest horse the quickest. It's really, really difficult to see a horse at the top, like the top image here of Silver. He is weak. He is kind of angular, I guess. You know, he'd only been out of racing here, I think, for about 5 months. He had 68 runs. He didn't finish racing till he was 10 or 11. And then the image below is 18 months later. And again, the horse, oh no, maybe 2 years, that'll be 2 years later because that's Blenheim again. Sorry, it was 2 years later. And the horse is more uphill in a better balance, carrying the rider in a better way, looks fuller, looks less like an ex-race horse, if you want to kind of say that. And that is 2 years. It's not kind of 2 seconds in 2 days. And as you know, you see always questions on social media of people saying, you know, well, how do I build top line in my horse? And it doesn't just be like feed it full of food, because the horse has got to be rideable, the horse has got to be happy, and they've got to understand their new job. The biggest thing I am very, 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 very fortunate with is that my grazing is very good. It used to be an old dairy farm. And what we really focus on here is our forage is very good, our grazing is very good, so that actually does a lot of the work for me. We didn't start doing forage analysis until I started working with the guys at Dengie, and I didn't realize the significance of it. And we, like I said earlier, have 3 different types of forage, and it was only when we got them analyzed. So we have hay, we have maybe let's call it less than desirable hay for our laminitic horses, and we have wrapped hay. Now, on appearance, you would say the wrapped hay is the kind of better quality, smells better, looks better, insert whatever you want. And the less than desirable lammy hay, you know, you look at it and you go, that's not so great. But again, the lammies want it, so that's fine. And you think, okay, that's low in sugar, perfect. We then got them analysed, and actually the hay, well, I don't know, Claire, if you want to say just how bright green John's hay was. You were like, Claire's already smirking at me.
The hay, yeah, very green, very, very green. Yes, very good quality hay.
So that was that was off
we
the
don't-
charts, wasn't it, in terms of its
Yeah, we don't often see hay as good as the hay that you had. So,
and then the lammy hay.
yeah, that's still quite good.
Yeah,
And that was
I think that was higher. That was higher than our wrapped hay, wasn't it? I think as well.
Yeah, and I think that was the challenge, given you've got a wide range of horses, so it's not just the thoroughbred. So the hay really suits the thoroughbreds, but perhaps not the warm bloods that need a little bit less.
Yeah, but then on appearance, I was like, but like in my naivety, I was like, but the wrapped hay looks the best. Like it looks, the green hay looks lovely, and the lammy hay, that doesn't look desirable. But
yeah, and I think that's the challenge, is you can't look at your forage and determine by the appearance how good it is. We can make some judgments, but certainly, yeah, it doesn't normally go hand in hand. So having some analysis is useful, because it means that we can make sure it's the best to start with for the types of horses that you're feeding. And as you were saying, it can go such a long way for these sort of thoroughbreds or poor doers. If we can get the forage right, if we can get really good quality forage, then we don't need to put as much into the bucket feed, and that's going to be really beneficial, and that's sort of a big game changer. And I think you're really lucky with the sort of grazing and the forage that you buy, that it goes such a long way. And we see horses that come to you that don't look so great when they turn up, and they turn around really quickly. And I'd love to say it was just the Dengie feed, but I think your forage plays a big part in that too.
Yeah, Can I just add one little thing on the forage analysis? So the sugar is the big challenge in terms of visibility. You can look at the digestibility, and if it's stalky and fibrous, it's going to more likely to be less digestible. But the sugar, there is very little indicator visually. So when you're talking LAMI, EMS type scenarios, that's your real challenge, and why analysis is invaluable.
It was like John, bless him, when he even brought the lammy hay, he didn't want to bring it because he was like, I'm not like happy with this hay. Like, I'm not happy. And I was like, it's perfect. It's fine.
What you need.
Yeah. And then we told him the numbers and he was like, oh. It's like, it's better than it looks. It's fine.
I think it was lower in protein, but much higher in water-soluble carbohydrates, I think, if I remember rightly.
Just insane. But yeah, so like Claire said, and okay, like we are very, very, very fortunate. And like Katie was touching on earlier, is that we turn out in either 2s, 3s, and we have the occasional 4, and how we turn those horses out in what groups. So some want to play, some don't, some need to learn herd dynamics. So that's where the cobs come in. The cobs are fantastic because they literally, their mission is to eat. And so they are very good at teaching the racehorses fresh out of racing that don't settle very well, that want to run around and want to pace. The cobs are like, we've got 15 hours worth of eating, get your head down. We don't want to play, we're eating. And they're very good because they teach the racehorses herd dynamics. And then once they settle, we might then find them another group if we've learned that they want to play, or they prefer mares, or they prefer geldings. We have mixed herds as well. And it's finding the right personalities. And we do shift the horses around, but they're in no bigger than 2s, 3s, and 4s, so that we don't have problems at gateways. But again, they're very content. They can play, they can groom, and they learn how to horse, and so they settle. And we are fortunate with the volume of land that we do have available to us. But it's a big thing. They have nice big fields. They can walk around, they can play, they can run, but they also settle, and the kind of environment is very calm as well. So there's not too much going on. They can't kind of watch us as much. They are closer to us in the winter, so they can see a bit more that's going on in the yard. But again, by that point, the fields really do a lot of the work of helping condition the horses and calm the horses and settle the horses. And like I said, our forage is a big game changer. And we don't want to necessarily talk about it, but it keeps the bills down as well. I'm not going to lie, because then I don't believe in feeding a lot of hard feed anyway, but we're not pumping these horses full of food. We don't have to. And I'd much rather spend a bit more on the forage than actually having to spend more on the feed side of things. So this horse here is Winter, aptly named, and he is 7, and he came to us in July, and I've got his numbers here actually. So Winter came to us and he was 486 kilos. So that's on the left, and it's taken in the same position. The sun's out, and you can see even with the sun, he really doesn't have much of a shine to his coat. He was a bit dull, he was a bit angular. Nothing wrong, he just had one of those things. And actually, again, something wasn't quite right with him as well, because you can't see it as well, but his back legs were slightly filled as well. Like he was just, something just wasn't quite right with him. And we haven't started doing anything with him yet, because he's just got stuff going on with his feet, so that needs sorting. But I also wasn't happy with how he was in his appearance. And then the images on the right, that was taken today, so that is 9 weeks later, and he weighed in at 520 kilos, so he's already gained 33 kilos, and he is not on anything exciting in terms of hard feed. He is just literally grass, forage, haylage, goes out at night, in during the day, has a nice couple of field friends, and that's all I've done with Winter. Nothing exciting, but he's in a much better place. His coat's better, he's shiny, he's actually got dapples. I think he looks pretty good. I'm quite chuffed with Winter at the minute. Like 33 kilos in 9 weeks. I'm quite chuffed with Winter. But Winter doesn't need to carry any more. Like at the minute, he looks perfect. He doesn't need to carry much more weight than that. To aid their kind of top line as well, it's like that development of posture, of trying to get the two to work together. So the bottom image of Harry is when we picked him up basically out of training. Someone had just started doing a little bit of retraining with him, and then 6 months later is the top image. I might just hit escape on that so you can see that a little bit better. So yeah, again, this is just change in posture and development of him. He's actually in theory got more of a tummy, she says in inverted commas, in the bottom image, but again, it's that development of top line and posture, and you can see how everything's kind of transferred up. He stands better by himself. That's not kind of making him stand up in any way. Obviously, the coat's different because it's winter to summer, but again, his coat's in a better quality. He can hold himself a lot better, and that is just a change of 6 months time, which was pretty cool for Harold. This is Greg. Greg, image on the right is 18 months out of having him out of retraining, and that is Greg today on the left. Again, it's that change in posture and development. So on the right, he looks more croup high. On the left, is again, because he's become stronger through the back. And for me, the biggest change as well as the size of his shoulder is not as much. So on the right image, his left shoulder is massive and his shoulder almost runs into his neck. Where actually on the left, you can see where you've got that separation of the neck and the shoulder isn't such a dominant kind of force because he's able to use himself better. The time difference in terms of year and seasons, that the one on the right is going into May, so he was struggling to lose his coat that year. So again, it's just a change in the transition of the horse. And the one on the left is obviously now into September with him starting to grow his winter coat. Shinier, more dappled, more conditioned. Greg is very sharp, very spooky. And he thinks it's hilarious to use me as a play toy. But again, he's actually become more rideable since he's being fed less. So he's fed healthy tummy and he's fed a balancer. And he is quite actually, so it might talk a bit more about him, but he actually struggles more in the summer than he does in the winter. Which might seem a bit mad. He's good on the grass, but he's not as grass sensitive as some of the other horses. In the summer, I struggle to keep weight on him and struggle to keep condition on him. And which is mad for some people, but in the winter he gains more. So like last winter, he can range between 632 to 616. And this summer he has the same range for 632 to 610. So he's an interesting one, isn't he, Clay? He's a bit more tricky. He is a trickster.
Yeah, definitely. And he sort of drops all of a sudden, doesn't he? He kind of when he's doing lots, he can swing quite a lot in terms of his weight.
He had colic surgery. It's why he left racing. He came over for Alaska on a plane, got colic, had colic surgery, had 50% of his intestine removed. So I've always been really cautious with the fiber that this horse has in terms of forage, making sure his gut's really healthy. And last year he ran himself up so badly that I actually got him scoped and he scoped clear. Yay, scope clear, feed, like happy horse, happy guts. But it was like, okay, so we ran bloods, but there was nothing wrong, but he just runs himself up in the summer, which is quite hard.
Yeah.
Isn't it?
I think with just you were saying about using a balancer alongside the healthy tummy is actually a complete feed, but we find that generally with your grazing and forage, we don't need to feed it at the full amount, certainly not in the summertime. So that's why we add a balancer in to top up. So just if anyone's a bit sort of confused, if you are using healthy tummy at the full recommended feeding rate, you wouldn't necessarily need a balancer to go alongside it. But if you're not feeding the full amount, that's where we pop in a balancer just to top up. And I think because they have so much forage and sort of grass available, you know, they don't need the quantity normally for the calories, but also sometimes when they've eaten a lot of grass overnight, they like to sleep in the daytime, and perhaps their appetites are not as big, which having seen you a lot, having a snooze, it's tiring being out at night.
But like Greg's another example of he's not fussy, but he picks at his food more than the others. So he has like 2 nets of different types of forage. So again, it's just as long as he's continually eating. And I'm always very worried about, again, his guts. I'm worried about all of their guts, but especially him when he's missing 50% of his guts to start with. It's not a good place to start. Like Katie was saying, comfort. And I don't know if it's like a proper equestrian word, but I use it quite a lot. Of like the comfort of the horse is so key. And like when I think of comfort, it's like their surroundings, what they're doing with their work. Like people think, like even having them in the arena 5 times a week, I don't agree with it, and I don't think the horses are happy for it. Their daily life, their routine. I know it's very difficult. I'm in a very fortunate position of, like Katie was saying about the number of handlers, it's myself and then I have one other person help me a couple of times a week. So it's just myself with the horses, and they do everything as a kind of group of all in together, all out together, obviously in their 2s and 3s, not 20 horses all moving at once. But their routine is very much the same. Their bedding, they've got big straw beds. They're very comfortable. They all want to sleep. And it's like, it's so important because you can always tell when you've had like a outsider horse arrive, because it's maybe a bit more unsettled, or it's come in from racing and it's a little bit more awake, and it, like, you see that horse being a bit awake, and then it actually calms down because all the others are like, we're just ignoring you. They kind of settle down, so that herd routine again kicks in, but it's the mass majority of they've all got to be settled and happy and chilled. They have access to forage. They go out every single day, even in the depths of winter when there's snow on the floor. They go out, even if it's 20-30 minutes, they've got to go out, be a horse, kick their heels up, play with their friends, destroy a neck hood or two. Making sure, again, even like when I've got owners and people coming on the yard, that I don't have a lot of people all at once. I kind of stagger people throughout the day. So again, we've never got these busy, chaotic yards. I know it's not the same for everyone with like DIY yards and livery yards, but I think routine is so key for these horses because they've been brought up in such a routine way. And they, you know, they are herd animals. So if one's upset and the rest of them don't stay chilled, they all slowly start winding and building themselves up. So making sure that there was also a study, I think, about the amount of human interaction. The horses don't actually, they need like, I think it's a day or two where they just have very minimal human interaction. So I'm not in my horses' faces all the time. There's me and 20 horses, so I'm spread across them all. But I do the job. Everything gets done. Everything they need gets done. But I'm not on them all the time, and I'm not with them like in their faces, in their space. It's very much like eat, come out, work, go away, chill, go to the field, do whatever. Again, it's very routine, but I'm not in their face and in their space all the time. They need to rest and recover. Like if anyone as a human does any sort of, I don't know, training or like running or anything like that, you have moments where you need to recover. Like as you're transforming these horses, they've got to be able to you know, things break down and they've got to build back up, and they need to be able to rest and be comfortable within that. And that then helps again to their stress levels, how they condition and how they move forward. So like just a couple of cases around, of course, just a couple of cases with horses that are coming for performance, which again leads to their kind of not being comfortable. And it's kind of, what does that look like? So this horse here came in, he was just on schooling livery. He was not comfortable, obviously, if anyone can't see that. And basically what we realized with this horse here is it was very much to do with his kind of first language understanding. Sorry, I don't know if that's easier to play it like that. Sorry, I didn't realize I was going to cough. But again, it was, why is this horse uncomfortable? Because it was riding him in a different way, in a different saddle, made him so much more comfortable. And the difference between these two videos is literally 24 hours of just riding him in his first career understanding, or what is potentially causing him pain. And when he turned up, he was 576 kilos. And we know that this horse now is 648 kilos. So it's a 72 kilo difference. And the main thing with this horse was that he had kissing spine, which we know is really prevalent in some ex-race horses. But it was like, because he was in pain in his body, no amount of food pumping him in, like he's a big chap, he's about 17 hands, he's huge. And like when he was 576, he looked really angular, a bit sunken, and no amount of food whilst that horse was in pain was going to cause anything to come up or down. It was finding the reason for him being in discomfort. Now his owner had already scoped him, and his owners he had ulcers, but he had ulcers due to the pain of his back. And then once we medicated his back, he was a much happier horse. And like I said, he's 72 kilos heavier for the happier, much, much happier. And the same with this horse here. This horse was severely uncomfortable. I'm going to say good a lot, sorry. And again, he had really bad kissing spine, the same as the horse prior. And his feet were horrific. So the farrier used to hate doing this horse. He couldn't keep a shoe on for more than 2 or 3 days. And it all attributed to itself. And this, again, was 3 weeks later. The horse had actually put on, I want to say, 12 kilos since he was with us. He had his back medicated. He then stopped losing front shoes. He could then grow a better foot quality. We changed his diet as well to, again, help him the whole way through. He was in a much fuller frame. He was able to move forward. His stress levels were less. My stress levels were less because I didn't have to go and find so many shoes. His owner was a lot less stressed. Everyone was much happier. And the main thing is the horse was comfortable, started to gain top line development, all of that. It all kind of contributes and it all works itself together. Same with this horse here. You're gonna be like, we've come onto a feed thing. Why is she showing us all the x-rays? So this horse here presented lame. And this horse was having close to 100 pounds a week on feed being pumped into it. And the owner was like, I'm at stat, I'm spending 100 quid a week. She even phoned Claire, 100 quid a week on this horse. It's not great and it's lame and it's struggling and XYZ ABC. Took some x-rays of his feet. His feet were shocking, absolutely shocking. These were his feet here, the middle, second image in, like there was actually a shoe on that foot, and that horse had only been shod 2 weeks prior, and the whole horse was kind of collapsing in front of us. And he was on a high cereal diet. His grazing was really, really poor. His forage was really, really, really poor. And so all of that combined meant that actually he couldn't grow any foot. The farrier needed to change as well. So it turned into a whole team effort. And these x-rays were 6-7 weeks later. And the amount of depth of sole that we managed, yes, he had 3-degree wedges put on, but the amount of depth of sole that he grew and the condition of the horse and the quality of the feet changed instantly. And it was nothing more than good quality grass, good quality forage. And we actually had him on a very basic feed, very, very basic. And then he started to get a shine to his coat. He started to get a covering and he came sound. So it doesn't mean it always works, but with this horse, it definitely did. And again, the horse was happier. He was out with his mates. He was playing with his friends. He was just more comfortable. He could come sound. He could balance himself better. He could then start developing his top line because he wasn't lame, full of 100 pound a week on feed, better forage, better grass. And the grass, again, helped his feet. I think it's really easy when we see these horses coming out of racing to say they're undernourished and they're thin. They're normally not, they're just fit. And that's the difference. I am going to put my hands up to say I did not realize the importance of vitamins and mineral, and both Katie and Claire are probably going to roll their eyes right now at me, but I really did not. And it was only since I've kind of like listened and learned that I've realized the importance of it. And even down to last winter, which we all know was the wettest winter ever and went on for miles and miles and miles, we lost the least amount of shoes. We have some horses that are here that are barefoot, but the horses that were shod, we lost the least amount of shoes in a winter, which I didn't realize and appreciate until it got pointed out to me. And then it also got pointed out to me that the diets are better. The horses were the most rideable they were last winter. And again, that wasn't because I just threw them out for 14 hours a day. We couldn't because we were so far underwater. But the horses came out of the winter looking amazing. They were all rideable. All their brains were intact. We were really, really, really happy. And that was due to feeding them less, feeding them better quality food in terms of better, higher vitamins and minerals. And it worked. And I'm not going to say annoyingly because I'm very happy, but it was just like, vitamins and minerals. I didn't have it right. And now I understand it a bit more. So, I get it and I'm living and learning. But we do have one, again, like this chap here is the chunkiest thing on 4 hooves you will ever meet in your life. He's about 15'2". He's like a little bulldog. He's square. He was a racehorse. He was a 7 furlonger, and he is chunky muck chunky. And he, in the winter, can go down to 592 kilos. And in the summer, he can go up to 640, sometimes a bit more if he tries really hard and pigs out a bit more. Now, he doesn't get anything exciting. He's actually fed on the Dengie Meadow Light, which might sound a bit of a plug, but that, can I say that's your most basic feed in terms of ration? Is that rude? Is that the right kind of phrase?
Basic, or it's the lowest calorie, sugar and starch one we've ever done. So it's the lowest nutritional value.
Okay, that one. That's the right turn of phrase. So yeah, Philip's on that, and he doesn't need any more. And it's like, so this horse actually isn't ridden in the winter very much when he's in at night because he is so sharp that we both end up sitting on the floor in a state because he decks me without meaning to, and he just can't cope and he piafs on the spot. So Philip only really does work when he's out overnight because he's, again, much happier. I get more out of him. He's happier. He's more content. So he gets worked predominantly in the summer months. But he's a chunky monkey, but he still needs stuff and his feet aren't great. He struggles with his feet. But again, he's lost less shoes and he's the most rideable he's ever been. And he's advanced level. He does flying changes and everything. And he is like on small amounts and he's really chunky. And Claire doesn't believe me when I told her that he raced. But
slowly.
You don't, do you? You don't believe me. You're like,
no, he's definitely the broadest racehorse I've seen.
He has a big heart, big lungs. But the other side of it is when you see horses that are like this mare here, this is Casey. And Casey, basically, the best way I can describe her is that she was a size 0 Paris fashion catwalk model. She was never angular. She was just incredibly light all the time. And she just wouldn't, she was neurotic when she turned up. Bless her, her brains were like scrambled eggs. She was in racing, came out of racing, went eventing, went back into racing, came back out of racing again. She did that 3 times. And then she turned up and her brains were just gone. And she wasn't settled in the stable. She would weave, she'd go out to the field, she would fence walk, she would run through the fencing if she saw anybody. She was just so upset about life, couldn't keep shoes on her. But with Casey now, Casey, we're really happy with Casey, so proud of Casey Cooks. And Casey, I'm just always saying, it sounds really silly, I'm like, just drop your belly down, stop being a size 0. And she, again, is on a very basic feed. She is so rideable now. It might sound silly, but I can get on her without having to lunge her and without fearing my life. And I can walk around on a long rein and go for a hack. And the biggest thing for her is for her to become settled and happy. And that has become through everything, her dynamics, field, being out overnight. She eats better now. She's putting on more condition. She's putting on more top line. She's better in her work. I can work her more effectively. It's like a whole horse approach, which has really helped and settled this horse. And she's now like dropping her tummy down. She no longer looks like a size 0, which is wonderful for Case. And then again, like this horse here that we had, again, poor performance horse. This horse turned up at 530 kilos. Again, not poor, not angular, not horrific, but you can just see that his belly kind of naturally goes up like you would expect. Very happy little chappy. But again, he was showing kind of poor performance post-racing. And you would kind of say from this video, but again, this is without a rider on board. And again, his was down to comfort. That's what it was down to. And this was him 4 months later of like, I didn't want to put the videos up of riding because it was just like, he was just not a happy chappy. But with him, again, those were his feet. It was down to, he was uncomfortable. His back, he had kissing spine. His feet were falling apart. Like when I talk about splits, they were horrific. All on the left-hand side. The left-hand side of his body was basically coming over and getting crushed. And again, it was a whole team approach. He left here at 592 kilos, more conditioned, more top line, able to move forward. Again, it's just that kind of overall rounder appearance. It's not fat. It's none of that. It's just slowly making the horse comfortable at all stages to then utilize everything they've got in front of them to be around a happier, glossier pony. And again, you could argue, well, that's winter and that's coming into summer, but even his coat in the winter just looked a bit scraggy and a bit dull and a bit meh. And yeah, all the supplements aren't all the answers. I get so many horses turn up and they're like, as they come off the truck, they get followed by tubs and tubs and tubs of food, and their feeds are like dust bowls. And then the owners say, well, their horses don't want to eat it. And I'm like, oh, would you? That looks really horrible. And they're like, oh, I need a bit of water. And it's like, it's just pluming full of stuff. And actually, the majority of the time, the horse doesn't need all of the things. It just needs a better management and forage and diet kind of approach. And again, with these photos here, it just shows the kind of the development of the balance of the horse. And actually, I would say Greg was at his, in theory, roundest in his stomach. Obviously, the top left image isn't him. But as he's developed in his canter work, you would say he was at his roundest in terms of his belly in the middle image when I could barely canter him and stay on him. But actually, as he's become more developed through his posture and his balance, he's then able to sit, push, go forward, like we were saying at the dressage horse at the beginning. But again, his guts have been happy, he's healthy, he's rideable. He was his most unrideable in the middle image, and he's his most rideable now, and that's not through making him quieter, it's through being able to develop him through the kind of posture and the way round. And knowing your horse is really key. So like I said, Greg struggles in the summer the most. That, so the image on the right is him in January. Nice, like really round a bit. He gets really chunky in the winter, and in the summer he just struggles a bit more. Some horses, we had one horse every like turn of season. So right about now, he was a national hunt horse for quite a few years. He drops a load of his weight because he thinks he's going to go racing. He just runs himself up, being ahead of the game. Some go the other way. They go onto the spring grass and they literally kind of look like their stomachs are about to explode. But again, it's knowing the horses and how they respond. We've got two that are so pH sensitive to the grass change, whether it's summer or winter, and they are really kind of quite tricky on their guts a little bit. So we just have to be mindful. But that again is times and years. So Like that middle image there of Greg was 18 months out into his retraining. And then the image on the left there of him cantering is year 5 of his development. So we're in year 5. It's 5 years. It's not 5 minutes. I think that's it. Yeah, that's it. Okay. Any questions? Is that all right? Any questions?
Brilliant. It was fantastic. And I really loved your reference to the vitamins, because actually one of the things I probably just should have highlighted in the, when you're shrinking the small intestinal villi, they are your site of absorption of things like fat soluble vitamins. So in these, everything is being reduced in terms of absorption capacity. So they might have had high sort of intakes of when they're in training, but how much they're actually absorbing is often up for debate. So that was really interesting insight. Couple of questions that we had in advance, actually. So Claire's been answering them on the chat as well. Thank you, Claire. I think the digestive aids one is probably quite difficult to answer specific to a horse. So if we can get information about a specific horse, then we can suggest which digestive aids to use for that individual. But as a general rule, if you've got continual stress, in inverted commas, things that are going to be potentially compromising the microbiota in the gut, then the rationale is to use the digestive support over the long term as well. You may find, as Lou's demonstrated, once they settle down and get used to their new diet, you could potentially take it out, but certainly there's no harm in using it continuously for that transition period. So just in case that's a question that other people have got in mind. Some of the other ones we had in advance were actually relating to things like mud fever, and you mentioned the really wet conditions. I don't know if either of you have any thoughts on what your sort of top tips are for. I know when we were chatting before, Claire, you were highlighting sort of skin support and balanced diet and things, but anything else you want to add to that whilst everyone's listening?
Yeah, I mean, just from a nutrition point of view, I suppose we don't normally think nutrition when we think mud fever, but I suppose just yeah, making sure the diet's balanced so that we're supporting the immune system, and omega-3 fatty acids might be beneficial. So things like micronized linseed or other sources of omega-3s might be beneficial to sort of make sure, if they're not already in the ration, that we can top up with that. Other than that, I think it's sort of more topical treatments, and Lou might have some tips. I don't know if you've
Yeah, the management side.
I feel like there might have been some mud fever last year, Lou.
Pig oil is my favorite thing on the planet. Pig oil is fantastic stuff. It's just very easy, non-invasive,
but perhaps more as a preventative as much as anything.
Yeah,
when
I'm always a prevention's better than cure. So I think if you're half a beat ahead of the game, and last winter especially, like even the feet got so wet and you saw so much lameness through just feet turning to paper, let alone the skin. And I always just think if you're half step ahead, great. But I think again, we can almost do too much sometimes. Like it's like we panic and then we pick and then we do, it's kind of, I think again, actually, I think even the bedding helps. Like again, if you've got the straw beds, I really do think bedding plays a massive part as well onto it, of like the whole management of the horse. Like wet legs, you want to get a hose pipe, but actually probably sometimes the worst thing you can do, just let it dry.
I think over the last few years, that's one thing that I've changed, and certainly sort of that we do much less hosing, let the mud dry and brush it off. If there isn't a problem there, then get them wet and
let it happen as it do. I was going to say, sorry, it's slightly off topic with the balances, like not off topic, but with the balances. I just saw like in the comments loads of people like questioning balances. I will say, hand on heart, when Claire said to me, we need to get them on a balancer if you can, and the bucket feed size was getting smaller, I was concerned, because I was like, Claire, we've got a yard full of ex-race horses. I'm about to see everything like literally disappear in front of me. And actually it went the other way. And I just want to highlight the fact is, like, I was a skeptic and I was like, nah, don't be stupid. I need to like surely. But it has been such a huge game changer.
I think on that note, I think one thing we haven't mentioned is actually alphabet, or I've missed it whilst I've been writing. We haven't mentioned it, but I think that was a game changer for you last winter.
So we had horses gain weight in the middle of winter, like December, January, February, the worst times when you're praying for the weather to get better and the sun to come out and the grass to grow, and you're like, how long before I can throw them out overnight? Again, when you're like, just feed them mouth feed, I was like, and what else?
Well, I did have it in the sort of example ration, and I think what was really interesting, a comment that somebody from the audience made, was her horse wouldn't eat alpha beet, but would actually eat alfalfa pellets and speedy beet, which is fine. The same end result. You've got the two components, so whatever works for your individual. But yeah, the digestibility of the sugar beet element, and it certainly in the studies that have been done helps to have a bit more of a prebiotic effect. So because it's so easy to break down, all your good bacteria proliferate, they're happy and healthy, and actually then they digest all the other things in the diet more efficiently as well. So it's this continual, if we optimize the health of everything, you get that benefit all the way through the digestive tract, and then obviously the horse benefits too. So, but yeah, good point to emphasize on that one. From a management, and there's definitely nothing we could advise nutritionally for this one, but on a management topic, Lou, do you have any tips for the loading? These horses that are difficult and challenging to load. You'd probably be a millionaire, multi-millionaire if you have the kind of easy answer to that, because I'm sure I'm not the only one that's had difficult to load horses, but it has been a question in advance, so I did want to just highlight it if there are any tips.
So there were a couple of things. I think we get almost too het up on the horse having to walk in and forward. So sometimes I'm like, we'll walk them over the ramp, like walk them over and across it. And everyone's like, but I want to go in it. I'm like, yeah, but just get them to. So you're basically, if you can keep the front feet moving and control the feet, you're already onto a winner. And as soon as the feet stop and they plant and they move, the feet aren't moving or they're not going forward, because even when the horse goes to the side of the ramp, the feet aren't moving forward, they're going to the side. So you've got to keep the front feet moving. So even if you can get them to go over the ramp and come back around, you've got to keep the front feet moving at all times. Again, I would kind of very much take the stance of, if the horse decides to go backwards, okay, fine, we go backwards. So that again, so that you're kind of, they go backwards, you ask them to go backwards, then you ask them to walk forwards. It's that pressure and release system. I do think sometimes it might be a bit controversial, but these horses have grown up in a chiffney since they were a yearling, and you've got to be very careful with how you use a chiffney. But I do think a lot of racehorses do respect a chiffney, and I have seen vast changes in racehorses that like won't stand for the farrier. You put a chiffney in and they just stand stock still. And it sounds mad, but they've just grown up in it since they were tiny. Yeah, but you have to be so cautious how you use them. You don't want to have it where a horse might get away from you with it on, because that's seriously dangerous. But I do sometimes think just pop a chiffney in and see if that makes life any different. Or like, or was it Monty Roberts halter type thing? Again, they just, or even just a snaffle bridle, start off with a snaffle bridle. It might just change them completely. Sometimes if you've got the setup and you can get the ramp more parallel to the floor, because again, they're used to loading bays where they just walk in, if that they don't go up, that can sometimes change it. But again, I know the setup's quite difficult. But I also just think, it comes down to time, patience, relationship with your horse, and that kind of horsemanship of, pressure and release, push, pull, go.
Would you my general advice is just don't load just when you have a competition or a training session or whatever. When you need to do it, just start doing it. Allocate yourself a whole weekend if necessary, when you haven't got any time pressures or other pressures on you, because inevitably when you're going somewhere and you've got a deadline, that's when you're communicating your stress potentially. So that and
also, you have to appreciate with some of them, they're not good. They can associate it with starting gates. So we used to do that with trailers. They were really bad with trailers because they would go in and literally start panicking. So even things like taking the middle, like having one brass bar and taking the middle partition out, that might help some horses because they don't feel that kind of claustrophobic thing. Like we have had that. My dad
I had that completely. A horse, I think, that was used to going in a lorry, and we would take him in a trailer, and he was freaking out in the actual trailer. And someone said that to me: just put the central bar across, give him the whole thing. And it's a bit counterintuitive because you think they're going to want support, but actually, as soon as he could stand, literally spread eagles, he was fine. Travelled as good as gold. So I suppose the experience when they're actually travelling counts for a lot as well, doesn't it? And probably what you do at the other end, go and do something nice.
And you've got to also walk through, because again, you spend so long trying to get them in, and you're like, shut them in, we're in. And it's like, actually be brave and walk off and come back around. And then you're like, but why would I do that? So because they've got to learn that they're not going to go in. And again, everyone naturally gets frantic in that moment of like, shut them in, and
The
it gets
horse, yeah.
and then they're like, so actually it's just got to be quite chilled, and you give yourself the time for it to go wrong, basically, is kind of along those lines. But it's just, we've got like, so Greg, for example, we have a 3.5 tonner, so it's rear facing, but he always has to go behind the passenger and has to have a bit more hind leg room, because again, he likes the balance by putting his legs wide. And if you try and put him in, he doesn't move a lot, but he's just not happy and he's not comfortable, which again, we know then he actually then gets diarrhea when he gets the other side if he hasn't traveled well and he's not been sent, like, and then you're like, your guts must be on fire, and now I've got to put my leg on you and ask you to do something and engage and lift your back, and you've currently got the squits, so your guts are going to be rife. So it's like, we even do things like, traveling them, we make sure they've got like, we give them like the Protexin Quick Fix and the Instabiotics from NAF. So again, we protect their guts whilst we're doing things under stress, because sometimes they can start associating it with that as well. So we do give them things so they travel better, their guts stay better whilst they're moving and going, because sometimes they're used to traveling lots and miles, but you never know how they feel when they come off the other end. Like, I know what it's like when I have an ulcer in my mouth, and that's annoying enough, let alone having my guts feel horrendous.
Yeah, and I guess if you were uncomfortable in your tummy, it's like, if you imagine someone putting a tight belt around it or putting pressure on you, we would all be uncomfortable, wouldn't we? But yeah, it's difficult because it is a huge amount of time and dedication to trying to undo some of that. But if you can drive them around, just come back home and it's no big deal. So actually, travel doesn't just mean you're going somewhere else.
Actually, that is the time when I put the carrots in the hay net. Like,
right.
to be fair, that is when I do it, when I'm traveling them, and I start putting carrots in hay nets. One, because I'm on my own, so I can get them in and do partition and stuff.
Yeah.
And they want to, but it encourages them to eat and drop their heads and neck. Because again, when they're traveling like this, I just feel like it's
tension.
Yeah. And then, like I said, if you're going competing or even for a lesson or anything, you want to get off the other end, and bearing in mind your aims might just be to go out and travel and have a nice time, but you're still going to ask a question of them. And if they're like this at you, it's kind of, you're not going to undo that by walking them for a couple of minutes. They've held themselves like that for, let's say, half an hour, 45 minutes, however long the journey's been. So if you can get them as comfortable as possible, then great.
Yeah. There's some quick questions. Actually, about the traveling, she just doesn't like to walk up the ramp. So your idea of trying to perhaps level that, if you can find somewhere, and you see that a lot in racing yards and studs actually, where it's horizontal, so she might not be used to going up. They bring the trailer to walk straight in, don't they? Sorry.
Level up, and I also then lunge some of mine on, which might sound a bit mad, but I lunge them up. So again, we're not in pull. You get the horse to step up and across and over. So I start by lunging them over the ramp and then lunging them up and across. Does that make sense? So then they go in. So again, you've got bodies, haven't you, as well? If you're going into a 3.5 ton, you fear of human being crushed. It's not great. So if you can teach them to lunge up alongside you, it means you can do ramp, get them in. You're not worried about them coming back out and panicking. It's a really easy way.
Actually, that's a good tip. I mean, and it's not always easy and practical, which again comes back to this, there are always limits. We have to be in the real world, but actually a horizontal ramp might be a really good thing to try. And there was a question on whether protein's contributing to leg filling, I think, and then it goes on to talk about lymphangitis. I think if we, in terms of leg filling, the lymphatic system doesn't have a pump. So like the circulatory system would have the heart to pump liquid around the body, the lymphatic system doesn't have that. So you are relying on a buildup of pressure. And actually, most of the lymph nodes in the horse are in the gut, in the large colon. So the actual act of feeding, so the peristalsis movements that you get from feeding, actually help to squeeze the lymph contents through the lymphatic system and clear and cleanse the sort of the body, if you like. So actually, just replicating natural sort of forage-based feeding is going to help with that. But also, in terms of the legs, it's basically, if you go from doing lots of exercise to static or sedentary very quickly, you're not allowing the lymph system to clear the waste products that you've accumulated from the exercise process. So if you can do a really good cool down, try not to leave them standing in the box. Again, the straw bedding tip, so they actually lay down and potentially get their feet at least maybe horizontal, maybe a little bit in the air. That's actually going to help the movement of the lymph as well. But yeah, the warming up, cooling down, lots of forage, and encouraging them to lay down and literally take the weight off their feet would be helpful. Lymphangitis is a bit of a different entity in terms of you know, kind of risk and issue, cause and all of that. And really, I would say diet's not, it's more you know, obviously some sort of infection and inflammation. I think it's fair to say we don't really fully know exactly why, but in a lot of cases. But Claire, I don't know if you want to add, but I haven't really come across anyone saying diet's going to make a huge difference on the evidence-based side of things.
No, I don't think so. I think generally in terms of reducing like swelling, I think the vets are normally recommending them moving as much as possible to sort of improve that. But other than that, I think it's normally sort of an infection that and as you say, inflammation.
Yeah. You don't often even see the kind of entry wound or issue. It can be tiny pinpricks and things that can let something in.
Yeah. I was actually speaking to an owner yesterday at a camp with a horse that had an abscess that had then sort of developed, and it's now got lymphangitis. I think it's secondary to this sort of abscess. So poor horse is in not a very good way. She's really struggling, but and on lots of medication and lots of vet visits at the moment. But yeah, it's really challenging, I think, when they do have lymphangitis.
Yeah, very hard to treat. And again, if you know, if movement's good, diet's obviously good, but only from the sense of having something going through the gut, what you know, really the sort of waste products of exercise or infection, another, like you say, another issue. The lymph system is clearing basically toxic things from the body. That's its role, is to kind of cleanse the body. So if an animal has got an infection or some other issue going on, its lymphatic system is going to be working harder. So but certainly not mismanaging him by the sort of diet that you've described. So yeah, unfortunately protein is the easy thing to blame on. It's the cause of most things, the cause of all evil, and yeah, actually it probably really isn't in most cases. I think we've gone through the questions. If there's nothing else coming in.
There's just one popped in about fly management.
Thin-skinned breeds. Yeah, some are in inverted commas, we agree with that. It's certainly gone to winter as well, temperature this week, but yeah, I don't know, Lou, have you got anything in terms of actual products that work, fly sheets, rugs and things from practical experience? Or
I'm really fortunate. We really don't struggle with flies very much here. Like we really don't. But I do have a few that are quite sensitive to flies and weather change and stuff like that. I think might be quite controversial. I don't think fly sprays work sometimes. Like I don't think they do. And so I don't actually go and fly spray any of my horses. The most they get is a fly bonnet on, and the odd one or two get a fly rug. But I'm very much conscious with mine is that they spend all winter in rugs. I don't want them in rugs in the summer if I can avoid it. But then they do, if the flies are bad, I think a fly rug is your best prevention if it's sending them bonkers, and a fly mask, because then it's not on them. I don't like flies on me. I hate it. But I think fly sprays, not jury's out on that one. Garlic, jury's out on that one too. I think again, it's just part of it. I think you can only do what you can do. If the horse has got access to possible shade, another friend as well, so they can use again tails and stuff. And if they're really upset, they'll walk around, they'll walk and graze a little bit more to keep them off them. But I just think again, cover them up, and that's the best you can do.
Yeah, I quite when they've got friends, actually, I think in herds they do head to tail and sort of swat each other's flies away, which there's lots of benefits to having them in small groups if you can, or pairs or something. But yeah, but easier said than done.
I think it's avoiding the sort of really sort of
Right.
times of day where there's lots of flies around. So sort of, I don't know, if they're sensitive when you're riding, maybe ride early morning. When it's a bit cooler, there's potentially less flies around then. I think yeah, I've got one that would be quite sensitive and isn't a fan, particularly when she's ridden. I mean, she is obviously not a fan the rest of the time, but that's the time that it affects me the most, I suppose. So yeah, I think if you can avoid the times of day, but yeah.
I think also your management of like, if your fields are poo picked a bit more. So if you have a poo pick field, less flies. If you've got cleaner water, less flies. If you've got less like cleaner beds, less flies. So do you know, like you can, the flies are always going to be around, but you can do stuff to minimize like, you know,
Yeah.
stuff like not great bedding, like all of that, they're going to be there. But if you can reduce it in other aspects, then I think that will help as well.
Yeah.
I've also tried this year the sort of what they call it premises fly spray. So rather than spraying the horse, like spraying your stable walls and stuff, and found that has been quite effective when we had a bit more of a fly issue.
I get those sticky things, like those
Yeah,
sticky
yeah,
things.
they can be quite useful sort of when they're inside. Not probably practical in the field, but
Yeah. Okay, I think actually I'm just going to one last, because I think one of the themes for today was the sort of welfare and stress aspect side of it, and there was an anecdotal story from one of the vets at the Colic conference about these EGGD cases and how frustrating it can be, and he gave the example actually of this horse that had persistently had EGGD for a really long period of time, all the treatment protocols, and ultimately they moved it so it had a friend, and they took it away from the paddock that bordered the public footpath. And he said, you know, it's purely anecdotal, but would you believe it? The EGGD went as soon as it had a friend and nobody sort of frightening it walking along the public footpath. And I think that was a thoroughbred. So when you've got these, you know, sensitive souls that, you know, want a friend and don't want to be frightened by people with their dogs or whatever, just some simple management changes after all that time, you know, and the problem resolved. So thank you, Claire and Lou. I'm going to wrap it up there as we're rapidly approaching 9 o'clock, but we would appreciate all your effort and time and contributions. Thank you to the audience for some great questions and interacting with us, and for attending live. The recording link will probably come out to you in an email, hopefully in the next week or so. Donna and our marketing team did a great job of turning these recordings around very quickly indeed. But if you look on the YouTube channel, if you don't receive an email in the next week or so, then it will be there. But thank you as ever, Lou, and I'll see you soon, Claire. Take care, everyone.
thank you.
Thank you. Bye. Bye.
Bye.